in the middle of chapter 1, Perek Aleph. So I think we're gonna cut a little bit short today because I'm not feeling me'achuz. But was that Miriam? You have a question? Someone's asking a question, or? I can't hear you.
Okay, unmute. Okay, two questions.
Two questions, great.
On the first class where you said Tanya is the name of this klipa that someone can feel, what do I need to learn Panemius Satorah, or I've already learned Tanya so many times, why do I have to learn it? Why does that being the starting word, or the book called Tanya, how does that break through that klipa? And by saying the word itself, do we break through the klipa?
Okay, so that's why we explained the word. We explained that I guess the simple meaning is that it's a skula, yeah, it's a mystical strength here, that there's such a klipa, and by starting with that word, somehow. But we explained this many times, every skula, other than being a skula, it's something very natural. So that's why we explained that in general, this is the content of the entire chapter. The content of the entire chapter is an abundance of perplexing questions. That's what the content is. Now, more that content is targeted to induce such a sensation by the studiers that he realizes, if we want to be maybe very, very precise and connected directly to the word Tanya, then again, what I'm saying now is off the top of my head. So if we connected directly to the word Tanya, we could say that by leaning all of these large existential questions, or at least the first questions, on an explicit biblical source, it's like if you ask me a question and I tell you that it's written explicitly, that's obvious. Saying Tanya is like saying that these are all obvious questions, obvious difficulties. Now, again, quoting them from a Talmudic source, appealing to the Torah scholar, is like presenting to him obvious questions on texts that he's studied very, very numerous times, and he'll never put together that there's even a perplex in here. And surfacing a very difficult question on a topic that you feel that you've studied very, very well serves to break your assumption of I know. So that's what's happening in the content of the whole question, of the whole chapter. Connecting it to the word Tanya, again, in the Tzemach Tzedek's word, I think the simple meaning there is that it's a skula. It's a spiritual. Either it's alluding to that. It's a hint that if you know of the Ari's klipa, then the Alter Rebbe is alluding to that. And if not, then it's alluding to it spiritually. It's a skula. But if we want, we could even connect the content of the chapter to the like in the Gemara, you could find things like that explicitly. Someone would ask a question, and then the answer would be that's an easy question because there's an explicit brayso about that. There's a Tanya. We've already we've already studied that. So why are you asking such a question? Again, what I'm saying now is, I don't know, it's off the top of my head, why that word specifically is implying that you don't know as much as you think you know. But the content of the chapter is definitely good. The flow of the chapter is absolutely asking very, very basic, very difficult questions of contradicting sources from, again, these are not esoteric sources, contradicting sources from the Mishnah to the Talmud, from the Zohar to the Mishnah, very, very basic things, and also psychologically asking very basic psychological questions. Should I think I'm a Rasha? Should I not think I'm a Rasha? Also leaning on very, very basic Jewish sources. So that's definitely the content of the chapter. Saying that also the word Tanya is also alluding to that this goes without saying because it comes from an explicit Talmudic source. Okay. We could even say that the word Tanya stresses that point, but that's again off the top of my head. The simple meaning of that word is it's a school. That's the simple meaning.
Okay.
The Alter Rebbe wanted to open with this word as a skula to break that klip.
And one other, my second question was on last week's class. So I had never noticed before that the kalos got a chas v'shalom. The depression didn't get a chas v'shalom, but the indifference gets a chas v'shalom. And I was just wondering, why is indifference worse than depression?
Again, simply I'd say that when he says kalos here, then he simply means that you'll also be negligible about your Yiddishkeit. Kalos means, okay, I'm not a tzaddik, I'm a rasha, so I will do Torah, I will do mitzvahs, kidu. The chas v'shalom is tied to a more practical outcome of that notion. If you want to be more specific, then I wouldn't use the word depression, because he doesn't say depression, he says atzvut, which is sadness. And also later on in the book, he will explain that there's good sadness and that there's what to do with this sadness. And then if a person finds himself as a rasha, it's not so clear that he shouldn't be sad. What type of sadness and how to refine that sadness, or what's a good sadness, what's a bad sadness, the difference between sadness and bitterness. It's a whole topic. But indifference, kalut, is legamre klipa. Throughout the whole book, it's going to be something very bad. And that's why it's a chas v'shalom. And the atzvus it's not so clear that it's bad. Otherwise, we've explained this many times, that throughout Tanya, back and forth, atzvus is the most important topic. It's also the most important element of one's psyche that needs birur. That's the main challenge of life, is to fix and understand, refine your sadness. As explained in many places in Chassidus, that this is the sadness is the etzem hakoach hamitaveh, the essence of your animal soul, and that essence is the part of the animal soul which is fixable and elevatable. So even though it could be a very bad klipa, as we know, that sadness could be the drive of all of your bad, it could also be the drive of all of your good. Again, these are things that we'll go through throughout the chapters. In chapter 26 through 34 is all discussing how sadness, or the refined sadness, which is shiflut, which is a low. Again, it's a low sensation. It's a bitter sensation, where a person is not happy with himself. He's not the merutzeh. It's not a pleasant sensation, how that is the main drive of life. He'll explain that throughout Tanya. So simply the reason one of them is chas v'shalom, the other isn't, is because one of them is bad and the other really, that's going to be the conclusion. Okay. And so these are all things alluded to, because he doesn't explain them yet, of course. Okay. But I'm saying these things, I don't think the Mefarshim explain these things, but it seems simple to me. This is why he says that, because he'll explain that sadness, even when he talks about sadness, he'll say, I don't know, maybe you should be sad. There are things that are good to be sad about. It's not, he doesn't say chas v'shalom, because that's not going to be the conclusion. But indifference is definitely bad. Indifference is like the most typical sensation of klipa. What a klipa is, a shell, is like a shell of indifference, or lack of sensation, lack of sensitivity. Coarseness, like a foreskin, which is just indifference. So indifference is much the essence of klipa, where you're like a lump of wood, he says later on. You need to be broken in smithereens. But as long as you're a lump of wood, then you can't be ignited. So again, I think it's understandable. The indifference is very, very bad. And sadness, there's bitterness, there's bad sadness, there's good sadness. It needs a lot of understanding.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So I think we've reached we read the three sources, two from the Talmud and one from the Zohar. That's when we reached Amar le Abaye. So the next question the Alter Rebbe quotes is that Rava says when they were again in the midst of studying that a Beinoni has no that a Rasha is only a Yetzer Hara. The last source we learned from Masechet Brachot is that. That in itself is a fascinating quotation that we'll need to explain. Again, the answer for this question, for instance, will be in chapter 13. So every question here he asks is answered in a different chapter. The big questions in the beginning of will I be sad, will I be happy? So there's no specific place where that's answered. It's answered throughout the book. Maybe you could say, especially in chapters, like I mentioned now, 26 to 34, but there's no specific place. But most of these questions, later on in the book, there's an explicit answer where he says, now I'm going to answer what I asked in chapter 1. So this question he brings now, this Ma'amar Chazal, this he will answer in chapter 13. And there he'll also explain this story he's saying now about Rabbah.
Is this Rabbi Bar Nachmani, this Rabbi?
I don't think so. No, it's just Rabbah. I don't, if I'm not mistaken. And he was Abaye's Chavrusa. Abaye and Rabbah, these are one of the couples of the Talmud.
Was he his uncle also? Was he his uncle?
I don't think they were Mishpacha at all, if I'm not mistaken. But
sorry, I didn't get what the question is.
Yeah, the question we started last week, the question was just a quotation. In Masechet Brachot, it says, Tzadikim Yetzer Tov Shoftan. Tzadik is one who is again, the word Shoftan, as he'll be very specific about later, means that this is his Shikul Dat. Shikul Dat is like his entire train of thought is all Yetzer Tov. And not just that he decrees with his Yetzer Tov, but that his Shvita means his judgment. Like judgment, like you say a person has lost his mind, so he's lost his judgment. So that's the word shofet, means a judge. So saying Yetzer Tov Shoftan means that his entire judgment is only Yetzer Tov. He only has one inner voice. And a Rasha, not only does he do bad, his judgment is all Yetzer Hara. He only has one inner voice to the other side. And the image, in light of this word here, the classic image of every person having two inner voices, Yetzer Tov, Yetzer Hara, two judges. So that's the Beinoni. It says only a Beinoni is Zev v'zeh Shofta. So again, this is a perplexing quotation. Only a Beinoni is Zev v'zeh Shoftan. A person who's not a Beinoni doesn't have judgment. He lacks judgment. You could say that I'd think that maybe he decrees wrong, or sometimes he judges this way, sometimes that way. But saying that he has no judgment, he's only Yetzer Hara. And a tzaddik has no judgment, he's only Yetzer Tov. And judgment means you're a Beinoni. It's a chidush. A Rasha has no Yetzer Tov. Yeah? So that needs explaining. Now, later on, in that Gemara, Rava says, again, simply in the context there, the students in the Beit Midrash were studying these topics. And Rabbi used himself, he was explaining what a tzaddik is, what a rasha is, what a beinoni is, and he used himself as an example. Kegon ana beinoni, that's what it says here. Omar Rabba kegon ana beinoni. Someone like me, that's an example for a beinoni. Now Rabba, of course, was a very, very big tzaddik. He was Gdol Hador, he was the greatest of the generation. So immediately when he says this, Abaye answers him, Amar le Abaye, if you're a Beinoni, if you're considered a Beinoni, lo shavik mar chaye lechol bria, then none of us, you haven't left anybody any room to survive. If you're a Beinoni, then we're all definitely worse than you. So if you're just a Beinoni, then we're all Reshaim. It says Reshaim b'chayehem kruim metim. Rasha is like someone who's died. He's like dead. So Abaye says to Rabbi that if you call yourself a Beinoni, then what are we? We're all Reshaim. So that's, again, the question the Gemara itself asks. And the bemes, there's no answer there. So this is the end of those quotations from the Gemara. Again, all of this needs to be explained. So also this quotation by Rabbi will be explained in chapter 14, I think, 13 or 14. So in order to explain all this is the Alter Rebbe now saying, we need to explain what it means to be a tzaddik and a rasha. We need to explain it well in order to settle all of these different quotations. The two different quotations from the Talmud, the Zohar, and by settling those quotations, we'll also be able to explain the earlier questions of should I think I'm a rasha, I'll be sad, I'll be happy. The order of the answers in the book are backwards. First he answers these questions, then he goes back. So the earlier the question in the chapter 1, the later the answer in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Now he asks another question. V'gam, in addition, not only do we need to explain these sources, in addition, we need to understand what lehavin kol ze ba'erite v'gam lehavin ma she'amar Eyov. We need to understand what's quoted in the name of Eyov. Now, it's not a verse in the book of Eyov. In Maseches Baba Batra, a tractate in the Talmud, in the beginning of Baba Batra, Perek Aleph. So the Talmud narrates a dialogue that went on between Eyov and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And everybody knows the story of Eyov, that Eyov was, it's not so clear who Eyov was, Bichlal, if he even existed, if he was just a mashal. A lot of sources in Chazal say he was Bichlal a goy. But anyway, he was a tzaddik, he was a good person, a very good person. And he was very successful in life. And the book of Eyov starts with how the Satan tells the Kadosh Baruch Hu that he gets reshut from Hashem to go and try Eyov, test Eyov. And then Eyov goes through hell. He goes through very, very harsh difficulties, and all his children die, and all his parnasa, and he gets tzarat, and v'chulei v'chulei. And at a certain point he snaps. He loses it. And he starts getting very angry with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. There's a whole story there. His three friends come to give him advice. A very important book. In one of the statements that he says about a Kadosh Baruch Hu, he says what's written here. How the Talmud quotes it. He says, Ribono shel olam, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ata barat tzadikim barat reshayim. So Eyov, he turns to Hashem, and he says, what do you want from people? You've created tzadikim, and you've created reshayim. And then you come around and you have a bone to pick with the reshayim for being reshayim. If you don't want there to be reshayim, you shouldn't have created reshayim. This is Eyov's ta'ana, Eyov's bone. This is the bone he picks with Hashem. And if you want everybody to be tzaddikim, why did you create people that are rishayim and you created people that are tzaddikim? So the Alter Rebbe asks that it's the most basic faith, and this is also the second portion here is also a quotation that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't create you as a tzaddik or a rasha. He creates you as a person. You have free will. You can decide to be a tzaddik or a rasha, seemingly. That's how I think. So how can it be that the Talmud says that Eyov says to Hashem, again, what Eyov says is a true statement. It's a verse. It's not, even though as explained in that book in length, that he snapped, that he didn't accept HaKadosh Baruch Hu's judgment on him wasn't beseder, but he was a tzaddik. What he said is true. He didn't say untrue things. Like the facts are true. If the facts weren't true, then the answer should be that you're wrong. Again, he says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you created tzaddikim, you created rishayim, and then you demand of everybody to be tzaddikim. So why did you do that? You should have created everybody tzaddikim. So the answer to him should be that Hashem never created a tzaddik or a rasha at all. He creates a person, a neutral person. And that person can choose to be and that person can then later on, throughout his life, he can choose to be a tzaddik or he can choose to be a rasha. But not that HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates you initially as a tzaddik or a rasha. But this is what Eiyov says. So how come Eiyov makes such a statement that there are people who were created Rishayim and there are people that were inherently created tzaddikim? And so also that statement by Eiyov needs understanding. V'hat tzaddik v'rasha lo kamar, because in that second quotation here is from Masechet Sotah. There it says that, again, in that same place where your neshama is coming down to earth. So Be'emet, it says there that everything is decreed for you. Who you're going to marry, where you're going to live, how much parnasa you'll have. But tzaddik v'rasha lo kamar, that wasn't decreed. Whether or not you'll be a tzaddik or a rasha, that's the only thing that's not decreed, that you can choose. So this is like a seeming direct contradiction with what Eiyov says. Eiyov says that Hashem creates you initially as a tzaddik or as a rasha. So also this contradiction needs to be understood. Say that as a question. The question is clear. So up until now, that was just contradictory sources. Now, in order to explain that, so we'll have to explain what mainly up until now, the questions were around tzaddikim and rishayim. What does it mean to be a tzaddik? What does it mean to be a rasha? That there's such a thing as a beinoni is bichlal a chidush. And that chidush, that the beinoni is a well-defined, it's not just someone in the middle, it's a well-defined level, as we've explained this before. So that's what he asks about now. First he proves it. So he says, we'll read from inside. He says like this. V'gam, also lehavin mahut madrigat beinoni. We need to understand the essence of this beinoni. Who is this beinoni? Up until now, I asked questions about the tzaddik and the rasha, and already I have some perplexion. I thought I knew who the tzaddik was and who the rasha was, and now I realize that it's not so clear. Many questions. But in addition, who's this beinoni? So the first thing he says, bevadai, for sure, certainly, eino mechtzah zchuyot u'mechtzah avonot. He's definitely not half good and half bad, half averos and half mitzvahs. Why? Why is that so definite? So, firstly, she'im ken ech ta'a Rabba be'atzmo lomar shu beinoni. So we just quoted that Rabbi called himself a beinoni. So we haven't explained that yet. But anyway you swing it, he says, that it definitely can't be a person who half of his time does averos, because there's no way Rabbi could have thought that he does averos half his life. So it has to be someone who doesn't do half averos and half mitzvahs. I mean, the seeming meaning of beinoni is half-half. So I could maybe think that this is what it means. So he says that certainly it doesn't mean that, or Rabbi could never have called himself a beinoni. How do we know that? V'noda, it's known that Rabbi, his whole life, for even one moment, never stopped from Torah study. It says in the Talmud, a story that he was so and he was so tedious, he was so strong in his learning of Torah, that even the angel of death wasn't able to take his neshama, Rabba's neshama. Why? Because he was constantly learning. So his neshama, he couldn't be killed. So the story is, the story is that in order to, when his time of passing came, the angel of death had to come by the window and make noise outside and distract him for a second. And then for that moment, when he distracted him, he took his neshama. This is a story in the Talmud. Now, the Rabbi just brings the story to say that Rava was a person who, even the angel of death, had to do some elaborate kunst to be able to take his neshama. How can you say that he was half averos, half mitzvahs? And what's the question?
So it was the story of Rabbi Bar Nachmani. They needed him in Shemayim to answer a question between Hashem and the Yeshiva Shalmaila in Saras. He was an expert in Saras. And there was a question of the white hair becomes before the blemish, or the blemish before the white hair, and no one could agree, and they knew he would know the answer, so they sent the Malach.
That's why this is Malach HaMavis. I don't know. I'll check. I'll look. Bli neder, I'll look. Rabbi Bar Nachmani is Rabbi. I'll look it up. Bli neder. By next week, I'll look it up. Because I don't know. That story, I mean, the only reason he brings the story is just that obviously this person isn't someone who's half Averis, half mitzvahs. If you have to, if even the Malach HaMavet has to create this elaborate opportunity to be able to catch him not learning Torah. So it's very, very unreasonable to think that he would hold himself as being half Averot, half mitzvah. So that's the first proof that he brings. ועוד, in addition, שהרי בשעה שעושה עוונות נקרא רשע גמור. Now the Alter Rebbe says much more that if a person does an Aveira, not only half Aveiras, any Aveira a person does, if a person does any Aveira, he's called a Rasha. And also if afterwards he does tshuva, he's called a tzaddik gamur. So if a person is doing an Aveira, he's a complete Rasha. If he's doing a mitzvah, he's a complete tzaddik. There's no room to be a Beinoni here. Who's the Beinoni? Even a person who doesn't have to be a chamor avera, like from the Torah. Even if a person passes one of our sages' mitzvahs, the Rabbanan, even a small mitzvah, the Rabbanan, is called a Rasha. That's explicit in Masechet Shavuos. Sorry, in Yevamis. And in Perikama Denida, he brings two quotes where it says explicitly that any person who does any small Aveira is immediately called a Rasha. So any little Aveira you do, you're a Rasha. A Beinoni is not a Rasha. So, and if you do tshuva, you're a tzaddik. So, who's this Beinoni? Even a person who was capable of telling a different Jew was doing an Aveira, and I was capable of reprimanding him. And I didn't reprimand him.
Warning.
Or not even, it doesn't have to even be warning or rebuking, could even be just like a symbolic mecha'ah. Mimchot could even be just to oppose. You say that's not the state of what you're doing. It could be, this example is usually what's brought a lot in halacha as the smallest deed you can do. Like that if the worst, very bad things are happening, the very minimum you can do is demonstrate, right? Go out and demonstrate. At the very minimum, pick up a sign and say, we disagree. Right? Obviously, if you can reprimand and you can fix and you can change, then you have to do that. But at the very least, you can express your disagreement. You can demonstrate. And the Chazal say that if you don't even do that, if a person allows evil to exist without even expressing his disagreement, so he's a Rasha. So you don't even have to do anything. You don't even have to be part of the problem. Just by not opposing it actively enough, you're already called a Rasha. So obviously, again, all of this is just to stress this point, that the Beinoni is someone who lacks any of these problems. So it goes without saying that if even these lightest things are called a Rasha, then obviously a person who's capable of learning Torah, doing mitzvahs, and he doesn't act upon that capability, so obviously he'd be called a Rasha. How do I know? For instance, a person, like a person who's capable of learning a lot of Torah and he doesn't learn Torah, that on this person, Chazal said, Ki dvar Hashem biza, that this person has what's the word in the translation there for biza, that he
despised.
Yeah, you could say despised. Not learning Torah when you can is like an insult, because you're showing that it doesn't interest you. It's not precious. So you despise, but not just that you despise it. You make it something despised. You present Torah as being something despised by not learning it when you're capable of learning it. So that statement is a very harsh statement, that a person who doesn't learn Torah is Dvar Hashem Bizah. He's despised the word of Hashem. It's definitely harsher than just being a Rasha. So obviously he's a Rasha, this person. Hakarot tikaret, it says, Hakarot tikaret hanefesh shahid. That soul will be nichrat, will be severed from its source. The Pshita, obviously, Mikrei Rashat, Feim Over Yisud Rabbanan, obviously, this person would be called a Rasha more than those other examples we brought of someone who didn't reprimand or passed over one of our sages, Horaot. Again, so the conclusion of all of this is that a Rasha, the smallest little thing you do against a Torah or a Kadosh Baruch Hu, is already, you're considered a Rasha. And obviously, if there's such a thing called a Beinoni who's not a Rasha, so he's not any of these things. What is he? We need to understand. But he's not any of these things. He's not a Rasha. He's also not a tzaddik. We need to understand what does that mean. But he's not these things. So already, Mishum Hacha, and this is already, from this we can understand how Rabba, Ta'ar Rabba Batzmul, Lomar Shu Beinoni, we can already start to understand how Rabba could hold himself to be a Beinoni. Because it really, being a Beinoni, definitely has nothing to do with half-half, because any one of these minuscule fragments of an Aveira would immediately make you a Rasha. So the Beinoni doesn't have any of these things. So we can begin to understand how Rabbah could hold himself to be a Beinoni. Nekuda. Now here there's an asterisk, if you're holding the book. I don't know if we'll stop for all of these asterisks, because most of actually this one isn't exactly that, but most of the Hagaot, the asterisks are like addendums that the Alter Rebbe put in. Most of them have to do with the Arizal's writings. Most of them, usually. Like settling a seeming contradiction with Kitvei Arizal, usually in Tanya. Here, it's a seeming contradiction with the Zohar, but usually it's the Alter Rebbe is answering a question that may be aroused in the Arizal's writings. Obviously, if you're proficient in the Arizal's writings. So I don't know if we'll take the time to settle all of these asterisks. So we'll read this one just now because we've stopped for it. He says like this: "V'ma shekatuv b'Zohar." In the Zohar it says, in Chelek Gimel it says, Kol shememu'atin avonotav, that anybody who his averos are lesser than his mitzvahs is called a Rasha. The exact opposite of what he just explained. That you can't say that. There's no way to think that a Beinoni that is somebody who has half, and a Rasha is if you have a majority of averos. So he says in the Zohar, it says exactly that anybody who has less averos less mitzvahs than averos is a Rasha, and if you have less averos, then you're not a Rasha.
This is saying the opposite. This is saying who has less averos is a tzaddik.
He's asking a question. The Zohar says that if you have less averot than mitzvot, you're a tzaddik.
Mm-hmm.
That's the exact opposite of what we just explained, seemingly.
Right.
So he explains that if you read in the Zohar there precisely, you'll see that that's not a statement by the Zohar, it's a question.
Uh-huh.
Zohar asks that. Rabbi Nuna in the Zohar is asking this of Eliyahu Navi. He asks Eliyahu, is this true that someone who has less averos than mitzvahs is a tzaddik? But if you continue on there, then you'll see that the answer Eliyahu tells him is exactly what I told you here. That no, that a tzaddik is someone is, like we explained before, that even a tzaddik v'ralo, an incomplete tzaddik, is someone who his evil is dominated by his good. Not that he has less averos, not that again that his deeds are less than his good, that his inner evil is dominated by his good. That's how Eliyahu Navi answers Rav Himnuna in the Zohar. So that quotation of the Zohar, it's not a statement of the Zohar, it's not a conclusion, it's a question. Mm-hmm. And the conclusion is as I explained here, says the Alter Rebbe. Then he adds 3 words, Veshivim panim laTorah. There's a famous footnote from the Rabbi. The Rabbi says that Shivim panim laTorah is a famous quotation. It means that anything in the Torah can be studied from 70 different angles. So the Rebbe says that the Alter Rebbe, by quoting that, just wants to say that that in light of what we just explained, like the Alter Rebbe himself, the style he used was that it goes without saying that this isn't that you can't say that. You can't say that a tzaddik is anybody who has more mitzvahs, and he brought very, very strong proof for that. So even that the Zohar would ask such a question is strange, because it's so obvious that that's not the case in light of what the Alter Rebbe has explained. So by saying Shivim Panim LaTorah, the Alter Rebbe wants to say that how could the Zohar even consider such a question? The Zohar, Rabbi Nuna had in his mind that maybe it's one of the angles, one of the legitimate angles of learning. But no, the conclusion of the Zohar there is that it's not. It's not even an option. It's not even in the Shivim Panim. It's not part of the 70 angles of the Torah. So there's no such option. So that's, again, the literal quotation. I don't want to dive too much into it because it's completely beside the point. So we come to the conclusion as the Alter Rebbe said inside here. I apologize, but I'm going to cut it short. I'm not feeling so well, and I hope next week we'll do a full class. I apologize. Only because I told Chavi yesterday I do the class, I almost canceled.